In the final decades of the 1st century CE, Rome applauded its new emperor with blind devotion, unaware that the true revolution he planned would take place not in the Senate, but beneath the Colosseum's sand. What the crowd celebrated as spectacle, he reimagined as an instrument of silence, obedience, and fear. This is the unspoken story of Emperor Domitian, how one ruler transformed the world's grandest arena into a hidden theater of forbidden punishments Rome was never meant to witness. In 81 CE, as Rome decorated its streets with garlands and perfumed water flowed through the public fountains, Emperor Domitian moved through the Colosseum with an expression that suggested neither pride nor excitement, but calculation. To the jubilant crowds cheering his name, he was a young ruler inheriting his father's legacy. Yet behind his measured gaze stirred a far older instinct, shaped not by celebration, but by the years he had grown up watching his family survive civil war, betrayal, and unpredictable executions. He had learned that Rome respected strength, but truly obeyed fear. The Colosseum had hosted triumphs for his brother Titus, yet Domitian saw in its vast corridors something far more valuable than public glory. He walked its upper levels with the detachment of a man selecting a tool rather than admiring a monument. The echoes of past games were still present in the walls: gladiator chants, roars of animals, the frenzy of a people hungry for distraction. But Domitian focused on the silences, the moments in which the arena held its breath. Those were the moments he believed held power. He leaned over the balustrade, studying the sand as though expecting it to reveal secrets. In his mind, the arena was not merely a space of entertainment, it was a stage capable of shaping the psychology of an empire. Rome, after decades of instability, now demanded a ruler who could impose order with unshakable authority. Domitian saw himself as that ruler, but he believed laws alone were insufficient. What kept Rome loyal, he thought, was the awareness that punishment could strike without warning. He recalled stories of earlier emperors, Caligula, Nero, and even certain generals during the civil wars who had used unconventional methods to extract confessions or dismantle conspiracies. Many of these practices had been officially condemned, labeled abuses of power. Yet Domitian studied them with the curiosity of a scholar and the cold discipline of a soldier. He saw in these forbidden precedents the outline of a system Rome had pretended to outgrow, but had never truly abandoned. As he descended into the lower corridors, accompanied by only a small escort of trusted guards, he examined the stone passages where slaves once moved unseen beneath the games. These tunnels, still rough from recent construction, fascinated him more than the golden seats above. Here, the cheers of the masses dissolved into muffled echoes. Here, men could disappear without disrupting the empire's celebrations. Domitian paused before a gated chamber where tools lay scattered: hooks, chains, wooden restraints used during animal displays or prisoner handling. Others might have dismissed them as crude instruments of stagecraft, but he studied them with a craftsman's eye, imagining how they might serve broader purposes. His guards stood motionless, unsure whether they were witnessing curiosity or the first steps of a darker plan. Emerging back into the sunlight, Domitian looked once more at the colossal structure. To Rome, it was entertainment. To him, it was potential. A ruler who wished to shape the soul of an empire, he believed, must learn not simply to punish, but to use punishment to define the limits of obedience. And for that, the arena would be his silent partner. Domitian returned to the Colosseum weeks after his coronation, this time without ceremony or escort. He arrived before dawn, when Rome's markets were silent and the streets still held the cool breath of night. Only a handful of architects, engineers, and overseers awaited him, men selected not for loyalty, but for their ability to keep secrets. Domitian descended with them into the hypogeum, a maze of wooden platforms, cages, iron mechanisms, and narrow tunnels that breathed stale air and old sorrow. The deeper they went, the more the world above vanished. The distant city sounds dissolved into a heavy quiet broken only by dripping water and the occasional rustle from the animal pens. These chambers had been designed to manage beasts, gladiators, and props for the spectacles. Yet Domitian saw immediately that they were underused, perhaps even misunderstood. To him, the darkness concealed possibility. At the lowest levels, he stopped before a long corridor where crude cells were carved into the stone. Inside, faint graffiti scratched by condemned prisoners lingered like the final fragments of vanished men. Domitian stepped close to the walls, tracing the uneven lines with the tips of his fingers. Then he asked the architects how much deeper they could build, how many chambers the foundation could bear, how discreetly these expansions could be completed. His tone was not one of inquiry, but of quiet expectation. The overseers hesitated. Rome had regulations regarding interrogation, confinement, and the treatment of citizens. Hidden rooms beneath the arena blurred those lines. Yet in Domitian's gaze, they saw no tolerance for moral hesitation, only the cold hunger of a ruler who believed that clarity in governance required shadows. And so, reluctantly, they told him what he wanted to hear. With careful reinforcement, they could build additional spaces undetected. Work began in secrecy. Laborers sworn to silence carved chambers that connected to no public entrance, passageways known only to a handful of guards. These rooms were designed not for spectacle, but for containment. Heavy doors were fitted with double locks. Torches were spaced deliberately far apart, forcing the corridors into half-darkness even when lit. The stale scent of earth and damp wood grew stronger as each day of construction passed. Before long, whispers spread among the workers. They spoke of strange sounds echoing at night from newly sealed corridors, low, human noises that did not resemble the roars of caged animals. Some claimed to have seen guards escorting hooded figures into the depths. Others muttered about tools removed from their usual storage, tools whose purpose seemed too precise, too deliberate for stage use. Though no one dared confront the overseers, every man understood that the Colosseum was being reshaped into something far more dangerous than a theater. Domitian visited often, always quietly, sometimes alone. He walked the unfinished corridors with an eerie familiarity, as if he had been waiting for this structure long before it existed. To him, these chambers represented freedom, not for Rome, but for himself. Here, far from the Senate's scrutiny, he could act without constraint. The arena would remain a public marvel, its violence justified by tradition. But beneath the sand, hidden from every eye, lay the beginnings of a system designed solely for fear. By the time the last stone was set into place, the Colosseum possessed two faces, one for the cheering masses above, and one for the condemned secrets below. Domitian, standing between them, believed he had finally discovered the perfect balance of power. Titus Flavius Sabinus, a seasoned statesman and distant relative of the imperial family, had survived 3 emperors and 2 civil wars. He understood the dangers of Roman politics better than most, yet nothing prepared him for the cold intensity with which Domitian regarded him during a routine Senate session. Sabinus had voiced mild disagreement over a financial decree, a gesture that, under previous rulers, would have been tolerated as part of civic debate. Under Domitian, it became an act of defiance. Rumors soon reached Sabinus's household. Trusted friends warned that the emperor had begun collecting accusations against him, claims of disloyalty, hidden alliances, and whispered conspiracies. None were true, yet Sabinus knew the danger did not lie in their accuracy, but in Domitian's willingness to believe them. The emperor's paranoia, once whispered about in private, now seeped openly into the Senate halls. Every man felt it, yet no one dared speak. Late one evening, a quiet knock echoed through Sabinus's home. Imperial guards entered without ceremony, presenting an order of arrest. Sabinus offered no resistance. He understood too well the futility of legal protests against a ruler who believed himself both judge and evidence. As he was escorted through the empty streets, he realized they were not heading toward any official court or prison. Instead, the path wound toward the Colosseum. His heart tightened. The arena was not a place for citizens of rank, unless something forbidden awaited him below. Domitian was already in the hypogeum when Sabinus arrived, accompanied by only 2 trusted officials. He greeted the senator with polite formality, the kind that concealed hostility behind perfect composure. Sabinus sensed immediately that this meeting was not to gather information, it was to break him. The emperor gestured to a chamber, one of the newly constructed rooms hidden from public knowledge. Inside, the air was cold, the walls damp, the silence oppressive. Instruments used in military punishment hung neatly on a table, restraints used for deserters, rods used for disciplinary beatings, and iron weights designed to strain joints until confession became a physical necessity. These were not tools for stage performances, they were tools for obedience. Domitian questioned Sabinus calmly, without raising his voice. He described the accusations against him, giving the senator every opportunity to confess. Sabinus denied each charge with steady dignity. His refusal to kneel, even metaphorically, irritated the emperor. Domitian marked his insolence not through rage, but through an unnerving stillness. Guards carried out the emperor's orders with mechanical precision. They used the punishments permitted for soldiers who deserted the battlefield, legal in military contexts, but deeply improper for a senator. Domitian exploited this gray area. The punishments were not officially outlawed, yet their application here erased every boundary Rome had ever claimed to respect. Hours passed in slow, deliberate increments. Eventually, Domitian ended the session, not because he had gained information, but because he had demonstrated power. Sabinus, weakened but unbroken, was escorted away to await a trial whose verdict was already decided. Above them, Rome continued its nightly celebrations, unaware that beneath the sand, a senator had vanished into the emperor's expanding shadow. By the third year of his reign, Domitian had perfected the duality of the Colosseum. Above, the city reveled in daylight games, gladiators clashing, beasts fighting, the customary applause of citizens distracted from their own struggles. But at night, the arena belonged entirely to him. These nocturnal spectacles were invisible to the public, attended only by select senators, loyal generals, and the few courtiers he trusted. What occurred under the moonlight was neither theater nor trial. It was an instrument of psychological dominance. Domitian revived punishments that previous emperors had banned or limited, resurrecting ancient cruelties in new configurations. Historical records attest to the use of vivicombustio, death by fire, and damnatio ad bestias, where men were thrown to animals. Domitian refined these with an obsession for precision and ceremony. Condemned prisoners were placed in small enclosures, sometimes forced to reenact imagined betrayals or symbolically correct their alleged transgressions before death. Nothing was left to chaos. Every act was staged to amplify terror. Naval mock battles, a rare historical practice in the Colosseum, were also adapted for secrecy. Shallow basins were filled under moonlight, and prisoners or gladiators were forced to fight, swim, or drown as part of orchestrated performances. Spectators were forced to watch in silence, seated at precarious points where the next victim might be an unfortunate official. Obedience was the unspoken condition of survival. Any disruption could result in immediate inclusion in the spectacle. The emotional tension rested not on gore alone, but on the awareness that Domitian's attention could shift at any moment. He would scrutinize, pause, and gesture, as though rewarding subtle reactions or noting improper posture. Senators, who had once debated openly in the forum, now walked with measured movements, their thoughts occupied as much by self-preservation as by the performances. The emperor's gaze became an extension of punishment, psychological, pervasive, and inescapable. Servants and guards circulated with mechanical precision, ensuring the prisoners and audience adhered to the unwritten codes. Torches flickered against the arena's arches, casting shadows that amplified the terror. The night air carried muffled cries, but these were always distant enough to prevent intervention, yet near enough to unsettle the most composed official. Domitian understood that fear, carefully curated, was more binding than law or decree. The games were not publicized. Rome knew of daylight entertainment, but no citizen outside the inner circle could describe the darkness below. This secrecy made the emperor's power absolute. He alone dictated which lives would be lost, which minds would tremble, and which allegiances would shift. Trust was impossible, loyalty enforced, and dissent silenced before it could manifest. As dawn approached, the arena above emptied. Domitian lingered, alone amid the silence and echoes of punishment. He watched the sand, imagining how each suppressed scream would shape Rome's obedience in the days to come. To the world, he remained a celebrated emperor. To those who had witnessed the night games, he was something far more terrifying. The orchestrator of hidden horrors, a man who had blurred the line between entertainment and execution, making fear the currency of his rule. In the corridors and hidden chambers of Domitian's Palatine residence and the Colosseum's hypogeum, silence was maintained by those who had no choice but to obey. Slaves, drawn from the farthest reaches of the empire, served not only as laborers, but as the living memory of the emperor's secrets. Their hands built the hidden rooms, cleaned the blood-stained floors, and transported prisoners whose screams never reached the light of day. They were the invisible architects of Rome's terror, witnesses who could never speak. One such man, Marcus, a middle-aged slave originally from Hispania, became the quiet observer of the emperor's unfolding darkness. His duties were ordinary in appearance, sweeping corridors, checking locks, and ensuring that instruments of punishment were polished and accounted for. Yet each day he walked past the chambers where political prisoners endured methods of discipline that defied conventional law, hearing muffled cries that would haunt him for years. Marcus realized that his own survival depended on a perfect performance of obedience, a flawless silence that even the smallest hesitation might breach. Domitian relied heavily on this network of slaves. Historical accounts describe his growing paranoia. No one could be trusted. Household attendants were periodically executed or replaced at his discretion, their fates serving as warnings to others. Marcus had seen 2 men vanish within the span of a month, their absence explained as transfers to distant estates, though he suspected otherwise. Fear was embedded in every stone of the palace, and the slaves carried it as a living weight, each aware that knowledge alone could be lethal. Despite the terror, Marcus bore witness to the calculated methodology behind every punishment. Instruments were meticulously cleaned, chambers arranged according to efficiency, and prisoners guided along precise routes to heighten the psychological impact. Every scream and every gesture of submission was catalogued in the minds of these servants, ensuring that Domitian's control extended beyond the moments of spectacle. Marcus, though powerless, became an archivist of fear, storing in his memory the horrors that the emperor preferred remain unseen by the public. Occasionally, Marcus caught glimpses of Domitian in the act of observation, a subtle nod, a hand raised toward the shadows, a pause to consider the effect of a ritualized punishment. The emperor did not speak, he did not shout. Yet the message was unmistakable. Obedience, silence, and complicity were demanded at all times. In these moments, Marcus understood the nature of power in Rome under Domitian, not law, not authority, but the unrelenting presence of fear enforced by those who had no voice. By the time night fell over the Colosseum and the city streets emptied, Marcus would linger in the corridors, listening to the final echoes of the day's punishments. Each sound carried a lesson, each shadow a warning. He knew that he would live another day only because he remained invisible, a witness whose survival required the careful balance of attention and invisibility. And as Rome slept above, Domitian's empire of terror relied not solely on his authority, but on thousands of silent slaves who carried his secrets deeper than any stone or sand could reach. Domitian's fascination with spectacle extended beyond simple combat. He sought ritual, symbolism, and psychological precision in every punishment. Gladiators were no longer merely entertainers. They became instruments in his deliberate orchestration of fear. Historical records hint at pre-combat humiliations and symbolic gestures, but under Domitian, these were elevated into structured ceremonies designed to convey messages of obedience, betrayal, and power. Each ritual was meticulously planned, a theater of torment that blurred the line between sport and execution. One gladiator, Marcus Aelius, a veteran of 30 battles, became central to these private performances. Once celebrated in the arena for skill and courage, he now found himself ensnared in Domitian's design for control. Chosen for a demonstration of moral correction, Marcus was forced to reenact mythological betrayals, stories of sons turning against fathers, generals deceiving emperors, and kings murdered by trusted allies. The acts were not mere mimicry, they were instruments of psychological terror, each movement scrutinized by the emperor and his closest advisors. Marcus understood immediately that failure, hesitation, or impropriety could be fatal. The condemned prisoners, often politicians or perceived threats to the emperor's authority, were inserted into these rituals to amplify the spectacle. They were bound, humiliated, and made to confront the cruelty of their own imagined treasons. The gladiator's skill was used against them, thrusts and feints calculated to maximize terror rather than injury, forcing prisoners into a dance of humiliation. To Domitian, the purpose was not chaos, but a controlled demonstration of consequence. Obedience was not optional, it was a performance. Preparations began hours in advance. Chambers beneath the arena were set with precision, chains aligned, floors swept, torches strategically placed to throw shadows across the sand. Guards moved silently, ensuring every participant knew their exact role. Marcus Aelius, while strong and experienced, found himself unsettled by the quiet deliberation of each punishment. This was not combat for survival, it was combat to reinforce the emperor's ideological supremacy. Each strike and movement carried meaning, a message to all who might watch or hear. As the ritual commenced, Domitian observed from a hidden gallery, his expression unreadable. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and dust. Prisoners reacted in a mixture of terror and disbelief, their movements mirrored or manipulated by the gladiators, who had been instructed to accentuate every gesture of weakness. Silence was enforced. No cries could escape beyond the chamber. The emperor's power extended beyond the physical. He was shaping perception, memory, and the very psychology of those who dared oppose him. By the end of the night, Marcus and the condemned emerged, if they survived, permanently marked. Some carried visible scars, others invisible, yet the lesson remained. The emperor's arena was not just a place of execution, but a stage for the ritualized assertion of absolute authority. Even the strongest men learned submission when confronted with the deliberate cruelty of Domitian's design. In this hidden theater, the gladiator's strength was transformed into a weapon of obedience, a chilling reminder of the reach of imperial terror. In the spring of 85 CE, Domitian invited a select group of senators, generals, and courtiers to a private banquet held directly above the hypogeum. Historical records, including Suetonius, hint at these gatherings, dark feasts where lavish displays hid a macabre reality beneath the floorboards. On this night, the emperor sought to impress and intimidate simultaneously, reminding Rome's elite that even proximity to power carried peril. The hall was adorned with black draperies, and the servants, trained in silence, moved like shadows, delivering silver dishes while avoiding any contact that might suggest familiarity. Guests took their seats along tables arranged to maximize exposure to the emperor's gaze. Torches flickered against the walls, casting shadows that twisted around their faces. The wine flowed freely, yet conversation was muted. Beneath the floor, the newly constructed chambers awaited, the hidden arena where political prisoners and rebellious gladiators were subjected to Domitian's private forms of punishment. Muffled cries occasionally traveled upward, blending with the clink of goblets, a subtle reminder that disobedience might be punished without warning. The emperor presided at the head of the table, his eyes scanning each face, noting tension, hesitation, or improper posture. No one dared speak unless first spoken to. Laughter, casual observation, or gossip could be fatal. Domitian's presence was not merely symbolic, it was a living measure of control. Each guest understood that their roles at this feast mirrored their place in the empire, observers of power, yet instruments in its theater. To misstep was to risk inclusion in the next spectacle below. Servants delivered courses that mimicked ritual, roasted birds arranged in patterns resembling battle formations, fruits carved to suggest symbolic acts of violence, and wines poured with precision as if marking time for events unseen. The silent orchestra of plates, silver, and footfalls reinforced the lesson. Order, obedience, and subtle fear were intertwined. Each guest felt it, and the awareness was inescapable. Occasionally, Domitian would rise, walking the length of the table, letting his gaze linger on those he doubted, testing the courage of each man under his scrutiny. A tremor of anxiety passed through the senators and officers, who had grown accustomed to the emperor's private methods but never truly reconciled with their implications. Some recalled rumors of men disappearing into the hypogeum only days before, never to return. Now, beneath their feet, the machinery of those punishments operated silently, feeding the narrative that Domitian's authority extended into every shadow of Rome. By night's end, the emperor allowed the guests to depart, leaving them to process the dual message of the feast: luxury above, horror below. This event marked a turning point in Rome's perception of Domitian. The nobles no longer saw him merely as a ruler. They saw the precision of cruelty as policy, the calculation of terror as method. Above the Colosseum, society celebrated. Below, fear had found its laboratory. And in that quiet, the distinction between amusement and execution blurred irrevocably. Julia Flavia, Domitian's niece and mistress, had long been a quiet presence in the emperor's life, admired for her intellect and her courage to speak when others remained silent. By the mid-80s CE, she had begun to see what few dared acknowledge: the depth of Domitian's private cruelty. Stories of his night games, the hidden chambers, and the rituals of punishment reached her ears through whispers of slaves and courtiers. Unlike others, she did not avert her eyes. Instead, she sought to confront the man she once believed capable of greatness. The confrontation occurred in the emperor's private chambers, a room adorned with gold, frescoes, and an oppressive order that mirrored the discipline of his mind. Julia spoke quietly, carefully weighing each word. She questioned the morality of his hidden punishments, appealing to his lingering sense of legacy and the image he projected as a ruler. "Domitian," she said, "Rome will remember you for your terror, not your empire. The people beneath your sand do not need spectacle. They need justice." Domitian listened with an unnerving calm. Historical sources portray him as reserved and deliberate, yet those close to him recognized the silent storm behind his eyes. To Julia, his stillness was a mask that barely concealed the growing unease within. For a moment, he considered the arguments, weighed the consequences of unchecked cruelty, and remembered the faint echo of his father's guidance: "A ruler is nothing without fear." And so, rather than yielding to her plea, Domitian's mind turned inward, imagining her words as both challenge and betrayal. Over the following weeks, his behavior shifted subtly but unmistakably. Julia noted the change. He questioned his attendance more sharply, scrutinized the night games with renewed obsession, and became increasingly intolerant of any dissent. The hidden chambers, once instruments of controlled authority, began to reflect Domitian's own paranoia. The slaves noticed it too. Guard rotations increased, punishments grew more elaborate, and whispered rumors of her warnings reached the hypogeum, as if even the walls had ears. Julia's position became precarious. Her voice, once a rare influence on Domitian's decisions, now endangered her. Friends and servants avoided her chambers, fearing that proximity could implicate them in imagined schemes. Despite her caution, she remained defiant, observing the growing toll of secrecy and fear on the empire. Domitian's cruelty was no longer directed solely at political threats or prisoners. It seeped into the lives of all who surrounded him. Her eventual fate, historically ambiguous, becomes a reflection of Domitian's escalation. Whether by accident, misjudged punishment, or deliberate silencing, Julia Flavia died quietly, removed from the public eye. Her death, while unremarked in the streets of Rome, marked the collapse of personal restraint within the emperor. Those closest to him realized that Domitian no longer distinguished between political expediency and personal vendetta. Human connection, even intimacy, was now subordinate to the machinery of fear he had perfected. In confronting the emperor, Julia had illuminated a truth few dared to see. cruelty could devour not only the subjects of power, but the hearts of those who loved it. Domitian's darkness had begun to consume the private spaces of his life, leaving a void filled only with strategy, obsession, and terror. The empire's public grandeur now masked a growing private decay, one that would soon echo across every corner of Rome. By 96 CE, Domitian's reign had stretched 15 years, yet his empire had grown brittle beneath the weight of secrecy and fear. The Colosseum, once a place of public amusement, had become a reflection of his mind, meticulously ordered, terrifying, and utterly isolated from reality. Senators whispered in hidden corridors, soldiers exchanged guarded nods, and palace staff, long trained in silence, began to recognize that the emperor's obsessive control had created cracks even in the most loyal networks. Conspiracies, though perilous, now formed in whispers. Marcus, the slave who had long carried Domitian's secrets, observed subtle changes in the behavior of his fellow attendants. Guards, once obedient without question, began exchanging glances during nightly inspections. Chamber officials, fearing the emperor's paranoia but emboldened by shared understanding, communicated through coded gestures and discreet notes. Even those closest to Domitian understood the truth. His obsession with hidden punishment and private spectacles had alienated all around him. The machinery of fear he had built was now unstable. In the shadows, ministers and senators plotted carefully. Historical accounts confirm that Domitian's own court, including his chamberlain and secretaries, contributed to the conspiracy. Each had endured years of watching friends and family vanish beneath the arena's sand. Each had witnessed the private games, the ritualized tortures, and the feasts where laughter and terror mingled. They recognized that the emperor's cruelty, once a tool of control, had become a threat to the stability of Rome itself. A single misstep could unravel the empire, and so coordination and patience became essential. The inner circle's plans were deliberate. Domitian's private corridors, hypogeum chambers, and palace passages, designed to conceal acts of punishment, now became routes for plotting rebellion. Marcus, ever the silent observer, watched as attendants relayed messages, locked and unlocked doors, and prepared instruments not for terror, but for an end long awaited. The same shadows that once hid prisoners now concealed conspirators. Knowledge of the hidden chambers, a source of fear for so long, was repurposed as leverage against the emperor. Psychologically, Domitian's isolation deepened his vulnerability. His obsession with secrecy meant that he trusted no one, yet he relied on attendants to maintain the very infrastructure of his authority. The conspirators exploited this duality. The corridors where he orchestrated punishment became traps for his downfall. Guards loyal only to Rome's preservation and not to his personal whim were placed strategically. The inner workings of the Colosseum and the palace, once instruments of terror, were now tools of revolt. The empire held its breath. Rome's streets remained calm as the illusion of stability persisted. Yet beneath the public celebrations, a quiet, coordinated dissent had taken root. Domitian, blind to the subtle gathering of forces against him, continued to refine his games and private rituals, unaware that the arena's hidden chambers would soon deliver the ultimate lesson. Fear, when overextended, becomes a weapon turned inward. The stage was set. The emperor's methods, perfected over years, were poised to be used against him. The silent observers, the enslaved witnesses, and the alienated nobility all converged toward a single, decisive moment. Rome, long subdued by terror, was ready to reclaim its voice. The morning of September 1896 CE began as any other in the imperial palace, quiet, controlled, and calculated. Domitian, unaware that his years of obsession with secrecy had finally turned against him, moved through the familiar corridors of his private chambers and the Colosseum's subterranean passages. The same hypogeum and hidden corridors that had allowed him to manipulate fear and orchestrate punishments were now silent witnesses to a reversal of fortune. The tools of terror he had designed with precision were rendered useless in the face of a patient, deliberate conspiracy. The conspirators, composed of palace staff, chamber officials, and even personal attendants, had observed the emperor for months. Marcus, the silent slave who had long witnessed every hidden punishment, understood the precise timing required to act. The corridors, once echoing with cries of the condemned, now carried only muffled movements and the careful steps of those determined to end a reign of terror. They moved with the same discipline the emperor had demanded of his victims, each step a measured act in the final ritual that would reclaim Rome from his obsessive control. Domitian's assassination was not a violent spectacle designed for public display. It was a quiet, intimate conclusion, executed in the same shadows that had concealed his private horrors. He was cornered in his chambers, confronted by those whose loyalty had been feigned but who had endured years of witnessing the empire's moral decay. The moment was swift. One blow, precise and deliberate, ended the life of a ruler who had ruled through fear, manipulation, and meticulous orchestration. The emperor, who had once watched helpless prisoners in the hypogeum tremble under the weight of anticipation, now faced the inevitability of his own mortality in the very spaces where he had once been omnipotent. After the deed, silence returned, heavier than before. The conspirators ensured that the palace retained its outward order. Marcus and others moved through corridors they had long maintained, now free from the constant tension of watching for arbitrary cruelty. The hypogeum, so long a theater of private terror, held only echoes of its former purpose, its chambers emptied of screams and rituals. In the private corridors, the only movement was the careful passage of the emperor's body, prepared for ceremonial display rather than spectacle. At dawn, the body of Domitian was carried past the Colosseum, the same arena where countless victims had vanished beneath the sand in secrecy. Rome's citizens, still asleep or unaware of the events above, would never know the intimate details of his death. To them, the empire remained ordered and imposing. To those who had observed the workings of fear firsthand, the display was a sobering reminder: tyranny is ultimately self-consuming. The arenas of power, meticulously constructed and fortified, can only sustain cruelty for so long before the instruments themselves turn inward. Domitian's last spectacle was neither celebrated nor mourned publicly. It was private, silent, and ironic, a ruler undone by the very secrecy and control that had defined his reign. The Colosseum, once the stage for orchestrated terror, now bore witness to the collapse of the emperor's authority. The shadowed corridors, the hidden chambers, and the silent witnesses of fear became the final testament to a principle as old as history itself. Those who wield absolute power through terror inevitably fall, and in the silence of their downfall, the empire endures.